Jeff, you're muted.
Thanks, Frank. Hi. I've been doing so many webinars, I forgot to unmute. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm the director of the Forum on the Arms Trade. It's really delightful to see so many people joining. I'm still muted. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. I was getting some interference from another thing. Sorry about that. I'm getting a feedback. I'm sorry, everybody. Jeff Aronson, the director of the Forum on the Arms Trade. Really delighted to have so many people here. I'm getting a delay. I'm sorry, everybody. I have to ignore what I hear myself. The Forum on the Arms Trade is a network of people who are concerned about the implications of the arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use. We are now 10 years old this week, which is very exciting. Starting from 6 experts, we're now, with our permanent listed experts and emerging expert program, more than 200 experts, which is great. And kicking off this week, a whole week of events for the Looking Ahead 2025 series. Really excited. Today's event, Arms Trade Issues in Europe in 2025. I want to thank our partners, the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, PAX, and Shadow World Investigations, which is also one of our 9 institutional partners. I'm here basically to detail how the technology will work, and then I will hand it over. So every audience members, you can see the Q&A. You can use the Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A. That's where the panelists will be looking for those questions. The chat is enabled so that audience members can chat and communicate with each other. Please keep that respectful. If something is disrespectful, I might have to shut down the chat, but a great place for people to feel engaged, interact. At the end of the webinar, there will be a chance to provide us some feedback through a survey, which we would really appreciate. And if you would like to potentially speak your question, there's the option to raise your hand. It'll be up to Frank whether to call on you, in which case I will then enable you to speak. You can also see each other's questions and ask in the Q&A there, or upvote so we know which questions are most important. With that, I will stop. I probably ran a little bit over, but I want to turn it over now to Frank Schleifer, who has in 8 years still not pronounced his name properly, but he is the project leader on arms trade issues at PAX, and he will be our moderator and introduce others. Over to you, and thanks again, Frank.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and welcome to everybody who joined this webinar from wherever you are. This is, as Jeff said, the first in a series of 5 that are held over the coming days, and if you want more information about them, of course, visit the Forum on the Arms Trade's website. My name is Frank Schleiper. I'm working at PAX, a Dutch peace organization, where I work on arms trade and arms export control issues. I will be moderating this event, which will consist of 3 pitches by the 3 excellent panelists that you can see on your screen now, that we have invited here today. And after these 3 pitches, I'll get back to all 3 of them with some follow-up questions and recommendations in 2 further rounds. And then the last 15 minutes of this webinar is reserved for space for all of you, all the attendees, to ask questions. You can do that, as Jeff mentioned, in the chat function. And if you want to, you can be invited to ask the questions while unmuting your microphone. Today's 3 panelists are Wendela de Vries. Wendela is a researcher and activist with Dutch NGO Stop Wapenhandel. Ruth Rode is researcher and project coordinator with Shadow World Investigations. And finally, Sam Perlow-Freeman. He is the research coordinator at Campaign Against Arms Trade, based in the UK. Welcome, all 3 of you. And as a background to this webinar, many European countries have ramped up arms production in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the European Union itself has assigned funds dedicated for doing so. Some states may further militarize nationally or cooperatively in the coming year in a push for greater independence from the US, with a significant risk that this will lead to more arms trade from Europe and to regions of concerns. The varied responses of European countries to arming Israel and the participation in the F-35 program in particular is also likely to continue to test commitments to human rights and conflict avoidance that are supposed to be at the heart of some of Europe's arms export control policies. So today, this webinar will dive into expectations of the arms trade in Europe in the coming year, where we will address some of the following questions. How will wars such as in Gaza and Ukraine continue to shape arms export policies as well as arms exports? How are states responding to an incoming Trump presidency? What is happening on a policy level in Europe? How can different countries be expected to react to all of this over the coming year? And last but not least, what recommendations and takeaways have panelists today for you? So, to kick off, first of all, Wendela, what is your take on what's going to happen the coming year?
Well, thank you, Frank. I will speak about the European Union because, as you said already, the European Union is ramping up its arms production with funds and with support policies, and this will definitely result in more and also more uncontrolled arms export. And there are two driving forces behind that. One is economic, and the other is military. And we should look at the forces that are shaping these policies to understand them and to counter them. The economic push for more militarization stems from a wish to strengthen the European technological base. The arms industry is considered a good way for new technological development, and the new European Commission has switched its attention from development of green and sustainable technology to military technology. You see that reflected in the Draghi report. One of the important aims of this policy is to move the red tape for industries, the supposed administrative burden imposed by European regulation. And an element of this red tape is the common position on the export of military technology and equipment, better known as the common position. An example of removing red tape is the Treaty of Aachen, also known as the Treaty of Toulouse, depending on which country you live in, which minimizes the control of military component export. And for small countries like the Netherlands, but also for other small countries which mainly produce components, that will mean that their arms export control will be handed over to the big countries with big military industries. Military industries can also evade control by joint production with non-EU countries. In that sense, it's of interest to look at the common production between European Union companies and Ukrainian arms companies. This common production is growing, and that is worrying because Ukraine is not affiliated with the European common position, which it should be, of course, before we start them helping building up an arms industry. It's notably worrying for a situation after ceasefire. We will not have a ceasefire in 24 hours after Trump comes in office, but there will be a ceasefire in due time, and then the control of what is in Ukraine might become a big problem. We also have to question ourselves what will happen with ramped up ammunition production in Europe that is used for the Ukraine war. This does not only concern the Rheinmetall production, but also, for example, the many Czech ammunition producers that work together now with Ukrainian producers. And notably, ammunition will become superfluous when a war stops, because then there's not that much demand. and the risk for re-export to everywhere in the world is quite big if we don't take measures to prevent that. Well, an important objective of the European Union military industry support is to improve the position of the military industry on the global arms market. It is an economic necessity as European Union arms production is not viable and not profitable without export. The internal demand in Europe is just too small and too fragmented. And above all, there is too much competition from the American military industry. And to earn back on investment, Europe has to export outside the European Union. And export restrictions like the common position are in the way of the ambitions of the European Commission. Well, the second risk of a breakdown of arms export control is the militarization of Europe in general, based on a supposed threat of Russia invading the West. Since the war in Ukraine, fear is stirred up in Europe to extreme heights, together with the fear that Trump will let Europe down or even turn against Europe, buying Greenland. And there's a strong call for strategic autonomy, and this includes a big, strong military industry based in Europe. In the present political constellation, anything in the way of military production is unwelcome. The European Union has a High Representative, Kaja Kallas, and the Commissioner for Defense, Kubilius, who both come from Baltic states and whose major, if not only focus, is arming against Russia. Kubilius is preparing a white paper on European defense, including investment needs for the arms industry, and I do not expect this white paper to include serious references to human rights-based arms export policy. Of course, the European Commission is not working in isolation, because national European governments also are more and more right-wing, authoritarian, masculine, and militaristic. They are quite dangerous. Well, the thing is, we are very much in the defensive as peace and human rights campaigners. We can continue to try to improve small parts of the common position or start court cases, but we lose, maybe not on paper, but in the reality, in the real world, even in the face of genocide. We are even in the defense against people that should be our allies. In the European Parliament, Green delegate Hannah Neumann said, "We should take away peacetime limits for arms production." Well, Hannah Neumann should be on our side. She should help us to control the arms export. So we have to adapt our strategies to get more people on board to support our position. In that sense, this webinar is a very welcome event. The present sentiment in Europe is that European arms industry is more important than everything else, more important than human rights and peace perspectives. Because what we think is wise and decent is overruled by right-wing Europe. We really need to rethink how we can act and react. If we don't counter the sentiment of militarism, we will not be able to maintain export control at all in the future. So I want to leave it with these quite pessimistic words, and we will have more time to elaborate later in the session.
Thank you, Vendela. Indeed, quite sobering words, but I can understand looking at the realities. Before I get back to you, first I'll turn to Ruud, and please, Ruud, your take on the situation in Europe in the coming year from a German perspective, but of course, feel free to elaborate a bit further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Frank, and also Vendela for your very interesting inputs. I will sort of build on a few of the things that Vendela has already mentioned. So I think it isn't an overstatement to say that we are at a very dangerous juncture at which we are seeing more and more explicitly how the arms export control regulations that have been drafted over decades and developed over decades in Europe essentially mean very little beyond the paper that they're written on. Of course, we shouldn't be under an illusion that this has been much different. In previous years, we have had quite a bit of research also in the last sort of 2 decades about the impacts of European arms transfer legislation, and the outcomes haven't always been as encouraging in terms of the restrictiveness that we would like to see, especially towards arms exports that can fuel conflict and human rights violations, as research, including by Sam Freeman, who's on this panel, has shown that major exporters, the primary driver of arms exports or determinant of arms exports to states in conflict is whether there was a pre-existing arms trade relationship. And I think that is something that we are seeing now, and that is increasingly becoming sort of a big problem of credibility for Europe, especially as we're looking towards the conflict in the Middle East, the genocide in Gaza that is becoming more and more undeniably one. Of course, Europe on this particular issue is not a monolith. We have countries that have imposed export embargoes. We have countries that have imposed partial embargoes. We have countries that continue to export to Israel. Nonetheless, the overarching trend that we're seeing is that arms export control regulations are essentially overridden at points where there are key strategic and ideological interests of European countries in exporting weapons. I think I agree with Wendela that this trend will continue and is particularly also driven by the internationalization of the industry. I would like to remind those, or have it as a new point to those in the audience who may not remember this, but the Eurofighter was one of the exceptions that Germany made to its arms export embargo on Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago on pressure of the United Kingdom. And we're seeing a similar pressure now from the US on the UK to exclude components for the F-35 from the UK's partial export stop to Israel. As Wendela was saying, as we're increasingly seeing these European joint productions, we're also increasingly seeing a sort of race to the bottom when it comes to arms export control regulations. And especially from a German perspective, we are seeing more and more taboos, I think, dropping. Germany used to be, at least in principle, an advocate for restrictive arms export controls, even if this wasn't always applied. But with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously, Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, famously declared a Zeitenwende, a turning point in Germany's military outlook. And most of you will know there are German elections coming up in February, and I really don't see this trend changing, even if the government is likely to change. So what is the conclusion from this? Is basically, as Wendela said, we have an increasing push towards more arms production, towards more militarization, with very little contradiction, very little space for reflection, including on the security risks the hard security risks that this approach brings. I want to give as an example Rheinmetall, one of the biggest beneficiaries of the current war in Ukraine, that is massively expanding its production, especially ammunition production, but they are also, for example, building a factory to build F-35 components in Germany, but they're also a major ammunition contributor, tank contributor to Ukraine. But they are also profiting of the situation in expanding their overseas joint military projects and their export of entire munitions factories. For example, recent research by Investigate Europe has shown Rheinmetall munitions factories that have gone to Saudi Arabia, have gone to Egypt, have gone to Indonesia. So really spreading basically globally these munitions factories. And when we're seeing German politicians talking about about the defense minister, for example, said that we should export to not perfect democracies in the context of India. That would have been quite a taboo thing to say in Germany a few years ago, and we're really not at that point anymore. I think that this is a very dangerous development because it is very short-sighted. We know that, for example, Russia is using for its munition production partially machines that come from Europe. So it is a very dangerous thing to only be considering the expansion of local industry at the expense of geopolitical and security prudence, not just in terms of human security, but also in terms of potential future conflict and harm. This all, I think, speaks to a larger weakness of European states when it comes to its role that I think it should be pursuing as more of a peace broker than an arms broker. We are leaving really the role of world diplomacy up to states like China and Qatar, when Europe would actually be quite well placed to play that role. And instead, we are ramping up arms production and decreasing our spending on diplomacy, on development, on establishing ourselves as a credible sort of global mediator. And I think it will come to essentially bite us sooner rather than later. As Vendela said, the war in Ukraine will at some point hopefully come to a ceasefire. And at that point, I find it hard to believe that that Europe will stop overproducing weapons. There will be an overproduction, and this will go and spill over into conflicts far beyond our shores, as it already is happening, with a weakened arms export control structure in place.
Thank you, Ruth. That was very clear. Yeah, some things that I saw indeed the parallels between what you said and Wendela on the European perspective. We'll get back to that as well. But first, a UK perspective from Sam. Sam, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thanks, Jeff, for organising this. So while Israel is far from the UK's most important arms customer, it is currently the most politically and morally salient, as the UK continues to supply military equipment for Israel for use in its ongoing genocide in Gaza, specifically components for the F-35, of which Israel has 39, which are being used with very high intensity in Gaza and for a couple of months in Lebanon last year, and of which the UK produces 15% of every plane. Last September, the newly elected Labour government acknowledged that Israel was not adhering to international humanitarian law in its operations in Gaza, specifically in the denial of aid and the abuse of prisoners, and that therefore, according to UK export license criteria, it was suspending a number of licenses, 29 in fact, for equipment to Israel that it judged was likely to be used in Gaza. But it made the big exception of components for the F-35 combat aircraft, provided that they are supplied indirectly via the US or another partner. And of course, in such incredibly high intensive combat operations and such a very complicated aircraft, it needs a constant supply of spare parts. So really, this continuing supply is essential to keeping them in the air and causing death and destruction in Gaza. It made this exception, admitting that it was a carve-out from the UK's normal arms export control criteria, but it said that it couldn't stop these components without disrupting the entire F-35 supply chain. Now, this is very dubious logistically. Every component is electronically tracked. It would not be an impossible or even necessarily a very difficult matter to put in place systems that ensure that UK-supplied components do not go to Israel. The problem is political, that this would anger the US, that it might jeopardize the UK's future in the F-35 program. And so the UK has put its strategic and defense industrial relationship with the US above its human rights, its international humanitarian law commitments, above its arms trade treaty commitments, and above simple concern for human life. This is being legally challenged, and we're expecting the substantive hearing for the case brought by Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq and Global Legal Action Network to happen sometime in the first half of this year. But short of this challenge, I really don't see any prospect for a change in UK government policy, which so often outsources foreign policy to the United States in this sort of matter. But I have to comment that the UK is not alone in this. There are now several European countries like Netherlands and Italy, which are also not allowing direct export of arms to Israel, but are still allowing indirect, and they're all using pretty much the same justification. Now, I heard one F-35 program spokesperson recently say that over 25% of each F-35 is made in Europe. So collectively, that's an awful lot of sway. If these countries actually wanted to, they could tell the US, we are no longer going to allow our components to be used in war crimes. Again, the problem is political. And frankly, the way the UK talks, it seems to see Israel's violations of international law in Gaza not as an outrage that demands action and accountability, but an unfortunate technical problem that regrettably requires them to take this very limited minimal action of of stopping certain licenses, while otherwise maintaining absolute complete support for Israel in spite of everything that it's doing. So the problem, I think, is not technical or logistical. It is a complete lack of political will or regard for the value of Palestinian lives. I want to talk a bit beyond Israel about the Eurofighter. There's been concerns expressed in the UK that it may be difficult for the UK to maintain Eurofighter production going forward, given limited numbers of orders, and before the next generation, the Tempest Global Combat Air Programme, actually gets properly going. And so they're looking for more exports. Now, this may have been alleviated a bit in that Spain, Italy, and Germany have all placed further orders, although the final assembly for these will be in their own countries. But still, the UK is very much looking for more export orders, and these will pretty much inevitably be the Middle East, who seem to be the only export customers interested. There's already reports of Qatar buying 12 more. What they want them for when they have Eurofighters, F-15s and Rafales already is not clear. And Turkey and Saudi Arabia are both very interested. These are both extremely concerning. Turkey is still occupying parts of northeast Syria. There's continual rumblings of further military action against the Kurds in Syria. Indeed, their proxy militias have already been attacking. And Saudi, of course, held a record number of executions last year, while the Yemen war, although on hold, is still far from solved. So this is really a case where, again, where for the UK, human rights and peace and security come very much second place to defence industrial concerns. So I've been going over a bit, so I will finish there.
Thank you, Sam. That was very clear indeed. I am now coming back to Wendela, with a follow-up question. Wendela, you elaborated mainly on the developments in the European Union, developments in the area of ramping up military production, and the prospects for that. Could you maybe also, since you're a Dutch person based in the Netherlands, reflect a little bit on how you see the Netherlands in all of this? Once upon a time, the Netherlands was known for a relatively restrictive export control policy, but with the new government, part of that has disappeared, and maybe disappeared already a bit before that. And in particular, maybe looking at the context of Dutch arms exports to Israel, what we've seen also in the Netherlands with the F-35. So yeah, maybe some reflections on the Dutch side of things.
Well, I think in the Netherlands, you see in the whole European Union already a longer continued push for more militarization, a very huge support for military production, a push on investment funds like pension funds to change the ethical policy and restart investing in the military industry. So yeah, you see reflected what you see in general in the European Union, in Brussels as well. You also see, as you know yourself only too well, that there has been court cases against export F-35 components to Israel. They are exported now not directly to Israel, but through the United States. Government is suggesting that they cannot change it, but it is a complete lack of political will. And it is very, very hard also for peace and human rights campaigners to counter this, because the idea that we need this arms industry for our security and for arming up against supposed Russian aggression to also to the Netherlands directly is very big. The whole narrative is very dominant, that we cannot do anything about arms production. We should support the arms industry, and therefore also we need to export to all kinds of countries to be economically viable. And yeah, of course, because we have a very right-wing government, there's also it's very difficult to raise the issue in the parliament, but also the opposition parties are not very open to argumentation that there should be a stricter control. Or they say, well, we should have control on the European Union level, whereas the European Union is extremely in favor of supporting arms export. So yeah, it's going not in the way that we want to see it, and it's difficult to find angles to address it. Also, what you see it also on other levels, like for example, that Latvia restarted to use landmines again, contrary to the ban on landmines, was raised in the Dutch parliament, and the response of the government was, this is completely acceptable because Russia invaded Ukraine. well, landmines have not become less dehuman weapons because Putin invaded Ukraine. So it's very hard to discuss weapons at all. Is this an answer to the question?
Yeah, that's certainly an answer, and indeed a very uphill battle that it probably always was, but maybe a bit more now than ever before. Thank you, Wendela. Over to Ruth. Ruth, on Germany. I mean, Germany is the according to statistics, the largest exporting country to Israel inside the European Union. Traditionally, we've seen Germany and France working quite a bit together, including on areas of arms export control policies. In the context of Israel, we've heard Macron saying something to the effect that they wouldn't export any weapons to Israel as long as the genocide in Gaza is ongoing. How do you look at German-French relations in this context? Is there any close relation at the moment in the context of arms exports? What about the German leadership in terms of morality? And yeah, thank you.
So I think for 2025, the big question is going to be who is going to be in government in Berlin. In terms of the relationship to France as well, I think Germany has sort of come closer to the French position which is basically we export wherever we want, as much as we want. The sort of current German government was going to redraft arms export control legislation, including introducing potentially a sort of majority voting system for joint arms exports. That never manifested. The law that was supposed to be passed hasn't happened. So it is going to be up essentially within the framework of this increased militarization push and increased arms export push from Germany under the Treaty of Aachen as well, that Wendela mentioned before. It's going to be up to the new German government how they implement this relationship. It really depends, though, I think, to some extent, who is in power. Not so much in terms of arms exports to Israel. We know that Germany has completely dug itself in when it comes to this issue. I will be honest that that in the period just after Nicaragua's case against Germany at the ICJ, there was a bit of a reduction in German arms exports to Israel, or licenses at least given for arms exports to Israel. However, as we have now seen, this does not represent a significant policy shift. Germany is still shipping, especially components, including licensing for tank components. I do think that we shouldn't underestimate also the contributions of other countries. The statistics that have been going around are based on CIPRI data, which is not comprehensive. For example, British contributions are completely hidden from this data. However, yes, it's true that Germany is one of the few European countries that has imposed, as far as we can tell, virtually no restrictions on exports. But more importantly also, or not more importantly, but also crucially, no European country essentially has imposed a two-way arms embargo. So activists from Israel also keep pointing out to me that it's really important to mention that European countries are massively subsidizing the Israeli arms industry through purchases from Israel, and which are also based on the occupation, are based on the genocide, are based on violations of Palestinian rights. The development of these weapons that are sold as battle tested, and that are also leading to more and more, again, joint production between also German companies and Israeli companies. Right now, a lot of those are supposedly destined for the European market. But again, the development of that technology and the investment that is flowing will also contribute inevitably to Israel's military posture. And I think Germany obviously has a very unique relationship with Israel, also on a military level. But I think Germany is really, I think that they are completely underestimating the damage they are doing to their own international reputation by essentially, in my view at least, learning the completely wrong lesson from our history by supporting this genocide with weapons. And I know that there are some people here from ECCHR who are also challenging the German government in court on these issues. So I mean, I'm always hoping that we might have a court that finally puts a stop to some of it. But so far, the courts have made rather strange, in my personal view, I'm not a lawyer, arguments that have continued to allow the export of certain weapons to Israel, or certain arms to Israel. Sorry, that was a rather lengthy reply. But it is a very relevant topic, I think, and one that is really harmful, not just to the Palestinians who are directly suffering from these exports, but also to German standing and reputation on this issue.
Thank you, Ruth. That was a very clear, very powerful answer. Finally, over to Sam. Sam, of course, everybody knows a couple of years ago, a majority of the people in your country voted for Brexit. You are not part of the EU anymore. Arms export control is sort of cut off from the EU. Traditionally, at the same time, the UK and the US have had always very strong connections, not least in the arms trade. But with a left-leaning government currently and an incoming president in the US that has a minister that is suggesting that some sort of revolution is needed in your country to overthrow the government. How do you look at UK versus EU and US relations when it comes to the arms trade?
Generally speaking, I think that Brexit barely impacted UK military relations with European countries, and that arms production relations have typically been conducted via ad hoc partnerships rather than through the EU. So Eurofighter is all European countries, but there was Tornado. No, the UK was, but that was before it became a full union, if you like, I think, Tornado. And the UK is involved in the F-35. The Global Combat Air Programme is UK, Italy, Japan. But as for relations with the US, I think that Keir Starmer will be doing absolutely everything he can to maintain strong relations with the United States. That has been the one constant of UK foreign policy for, well, since World War II, basically, or at least certainly since Suez. I suspect for all Elon Musk's bloviating that the UK is, although the relationship has never been as special for the US as it is for the UK, I think the UK is likely to remain an important ally. It's involved in too many military programs. I think the interesting question will be if Trump does make a sort of sudden cut-off of arms supplies to Ukraine, and how the UK would then perhaps be forced to turn to Europe in terms of trying to continue support to Ukraine if that's what they do. But while in trade there may well be choices to be made between the US and the EU, I think the most likely thing is that military arms industry relations with both are likely to continue in a similar way to how they have been.
Okay, thank you, Sam. That was clear. Unlike I suggested earlier, we don't actually have time for a third round, so I propose to just go straight to the questions. There are a couple of them in the Q&A section here, and not always, as I can see as I go through them quickly, are they necessarily addressed to someone in particular. But we also don't have time for each three panelists to answer every question. So I'd rather, just go through them. And if either of the three panelists feels like answering the question, just go ahead. I will just read them out because I think that's the quickest and easiest for this purpose. The first question is from Jessica Steffens, and she asks, should we expect to see efforts by the EU and/or EU member countries to prevent import of ITAR-controlled goods? Any of the panelists an answer?
Can I ask Jessica to clarify a bit the reasoning behind this question, in the sense that I don't think Europe will stop importing weapons, but I don't know if that's the question.
But maybe if you could quickly unmute Jessica and quickly elaborate a bit on your question. Is that possible? Are you willing to do so?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation and the opportunity just to clarify. I think there's been some concern that there's been efforts by a couple of the EU member countries to restrict importation of ITAR-controlled goods, whether it's munitions or firearms. And I think that's where the concern is from the US perspective, that there will be fewer opportunities to work together in that space in the event that those types of regulations come about. And a lot of it is sourced from the fact that countries are not supportive or do not necessarily appreciate the ITAR controls and how they are imposed on imported goods.
In terms of the controls on re-export specifically of equipment, of anything containing them?
Exactly, correct. Thank you.
I mean, I've not followed this issue closely, so I haven't seen any of the specific moves or talk that there's come from individual countries, but I find it unlikely in that most European arms producers are just too dependent on US supply chains to a greater or lesser extent. It's possible that with France it's to a lesser extent, but even there I suspect that there's just too much intertwining. So maybe in some areas, if they can find ways of producing equipment without ITAR controlled components, but my guess is that it would be the exception rather than the norm.
Okay, thank you, Sam, for answering that question. If people don't mind, I'll go first through the people who are not anonymous question askers. I mean, not that it's not allowed to, but I think we have maybe too many questions, and I'll go first to the people who have identified themselves. Next question is from Josephine Solanki, and her question is, which strategic leverage points do you see for activists to at least try and mitigate some of the damage being done by this rapid militarization. So maybe Wendela or Ruth, either of you has?
Yeah, I can speak very long about this issue. But I think, of course, we have to counter this militarization drive. Well, I think that this is important. It is partly based on fear, of the stirring up of fear. It's really Cold War-like fear, Red Scar, but now it's not red. It's Putin, but it's quite unrealistic. The gap between the real dangers that are there, which are probably dangers for some of the European countries in the east of Europe, and also disturbances in the cyber field. Those can be seen as real threats from Russia, and are not met by more fighter jets, more tanks, more old-style land war kind of militarization that is now proposed by countries in the West. So I think it is necessary that people start to see this gap between what is real threat and which should be met in other ways than by buying more military hardware, and also that they should realize that the fear that they feel for Putin can be countered by the fear that we have to feel for Trump, who is going to be a very unreliable object, being the most leading country in the NATO, with access to nuclear weapons, completely unpredictable. So we have to counter the dangers in other ways. I think that people accept the militarization because they are afraid, but we have to be afraid for other things than we are now countering with militarization. This is quite a complex answer, but I think this is the core of what we have to do.
Maybe to go a little bit deeper into that, there's another question from Anastasiadakis, who asked, could the panel reflect on other social movements and campaigns that can join up with peace and human rights movements to challenge the wider political currents promoting militarization and arms exports? Yep, Ruth, will you go?
Yeah, I mean, on both of these questions, I think there are essentially three strands that we as activists have to follow at this point. First, we have to counter the cultural militarization. It can't become, military solutions can't become common sense. I really see this difference between the UK and Germany a couple of years ago, and we need to team up, I think, more increasingly as activists, also with producers of cultural goods, be it books, be it films, be it even music. Like, I really think that the cultural avenue and the presence of counter narratives in public spaces is really crucial. Like, the level of difference that I see from a German coming as a German to the UK in terms of the militarization of the society is intense. Like, just the presence of a British soldier on virtually every BBC program. Like, it's so normalized that there would be a British soldier just in the public space on some game show or something. Like, the same wasn't true for Germany a couple of years ago, and they're trying to make it the case now. They're trying to implement themselves as more of a central feature, a common sense part of society. And I think that's something that we really have to tackle. The second is, there are some groups that have a lot more experience in the field of direct action than the peace movement does at this point. The climate movement has built an incredible force when it comes to direct action, and I think the UK in some instances in that case is further along than other European countries in these movements joining up and learning strategy from each other. especially when it comes to actual on the street, on the ground, at the arms manufacturers strategy. And the third is on a sort of policy level. I really think we shouldn't let ourselves get into the defensive too much. I think we should push for the humanitarian aspect to take more center stage again, to talk. Why are we talking about the arms trade? Why are we talking about the issues of militarization? And the reason is because of the actual physical harm that these structures produce. And I think highlighting those, there are many groups that have a lot of experience in doing this, and we are all, I think, involved in different ways in already collaborating with these movements, like especially, for example, the Palestinian movement has a lot of experience highlighting, telling their stories, even though frustratingly it's not being heard, they're not being heard as much as they should be. But I really think that there is a lot of space to work with different groups who have experience in these kinds of different domains of how to address certain issues that we're also facing.
Yep, thank you, Ruth. Very, very good reflection. Sam, some last words of you before I close and hand over.
I agree with Ruth that in many ways the two key areas for anti-militarists to focus on is, one, the climate crisis, and working with climate groups, that this is the absolute #1 threat to all of humanity. It is urgent, and our governments are not doing nearly enough about it. It's a very strong area for direct action as well as traditional political campaigning. And of course, it's something to which the world's militaries are a major and under-discussed contributor, 5.5% of global emissions coming from the military at least, and Palestine. That the Palestine solidarity movement has thrown such a spotlight on what the arms industry is doing, the arms industry's role in that, and on the broader approach of militarism, of military solutions to everything, and challenging that. So I read recently that in the UK, some arms firms are stopping going to university recruitment fairs because they've basically become too unpopular in those circles. And so I think focus on those issues is probably the best way to challenge the broader culture of militarism. I think trying to argue directly that there's no real military threat from Russia is not a winning argument. Eventually we need to get to a place where the West, Russia, China are all moving away from their militaristic approaches to the world and are disarming. But sort of simply trying to say that Europe has nothing to worry about from Russia and potential Russian military action, I don't think we're going to convince many people of that. But going towards the anti-militarist route via the climate issue and via Palestine has, I think, a lot more chance of success longer term.
Thank you, Sam. And mindful of the time, we're 1 minute to the hour. I want to go back quickly to a few other questions that we couldn't address anymore. Some of them you may address them again over the coming week when other webinars, including one on legal issues and one on where landmines and cluster munitions will be dealt with. I would invite you to get to these webinars and ask these questions. there. Then I want to thank Wendela, Ruth, and Sam for their great inputs to this discussion. I want to thank, of course, all the attendees for joining this webinar. And lastly, I want to hand over to Jeff for some final remarks. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Yeah, just to echo what Frank said, tomorrow's event will be on legal questions. On Wednesday, the event will be on humanitarian disarmament with some of these issues that are being raised. And Vendela mentioned, I don't know the Latvia example, but Lithuania has said it will withdraw from the Convention on Cluster Munitions. So what's the pushback on that front? Just a reminder, the Forum on the Arms Trade itself does not take positions. It provides a platform for other speakers. And I think you can tell that there was not much disagreement amongst them, and I think they made their cases forcefully, and I hope it was useful for all. We will follow up with additional information, and I want to thank the panelists and you all for joining in, and that will be the end. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye for now.